Behind the polished gates of royal residences, where protocol governs every breath and cameras capture every smile, there exists a truth that few ever witness. It's the moment when duty collides with humanity, when the weight of what one has seen becomes too heavy for even the strongest shoulders to bear. This is the story of a woman who carried the world's expectations on her back, who smiled through ceremonies while images of suffering burned behind her eyes. A woman whose public strength masked a private battle that would unfold in the sacred silence of royal walls, witnessed only by those sworn to protect not just her body, but her secrets. Some stories are never meant to be told. Some moments are too raw, too human for public consumption. But sometimes those are exactly the stories that need to be heard because they remind us that behind every crown, every title, every carefully crafted public image beats the heart of someone just trying to survive their own compassion. This is what happened when Sophie returned from Sudan, and why the royal guard will never speak of what they saw that day. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac as Sophie stepped down from the Royal Air Force aircraft, her designer heels clicking against the metal steps with the same measured precision that had carried her through 6 days in Sudan. To the waiting photographers and officials, she appeared every inch the composed royal dignitary. Her navy blue suit crisp despite the long journey, her hair perfectly styled, her smile warm but professional. The cameras captured what they always captured, the image of duty personified. But James Morrison, the lead royal protection officer assigned her detail, noticed what others missed. He had worked royal protection for 12 years, long enough to read the subtle signs that spoke louder than any public statement. Sophie's left hand gripped her clutch bag with white knuckles. Her smile never quite reached her eyes, and when she thought no one was looking, her shoulders would drop just slightly, as if she were carrying an invisible weight. The official reception at the embassy had been flawless. Sophie delivered her remarks about the humanitarian crisis with the same eloquence that had made her one of the most effective members of the royal family in international relations. She spoke of hope, of resilience, of the international community's commitment to the Sudanese people. The assembled dignitaries nodded approvingly. The ambassador praised her genuine connection with the refugees they had visited. The aid workers thanked her for bringing global attention to their cause. James watched from his position by the door, his trained eyes constantly scanning for threats, while part of his attention remained fixed on Sophie. She was performing perfectly, too perfectly. In his years of protection work, he had learned to distinguish between genuine composure and the kind of rigid control that came from someone holding themselves together by sheer force of will. The journey back to England passed in unusual silence. Sophie typically used flight time to debrief with her private secretary, reviewing the mission's outcomes and planning follow-up initiatives. This time, she sat by the window, staring out at the clouds below, occasionally making notes in a leather journal that she held close to her chest. When her secretary approached with the customary post-mission briefing materials, Sophie politely but firmly postponed the discussion. "I need some time to process everything first," she said, her voice steady but lacking its usual warmth. "We'll review everything tomorrow." The secretary, accustomed to Sophie's methodical approach to her duties, accepted this without question. But James noticed the way Sophie's pen had stopped moving across the journal pages, noticed how her gaze had grown distant, as if she were seeing something beyond the airplane window that the rest of them couldn't perceive. The Sudan mission had been Sophie's idea. For months, she had lobbied the palace for permission to visit the refugee camps, arguing that royal attention could accelerate international aid efforts. The Foreign Office had been reluctant. The security situation remained unpredictable, and there were concerns about the appropriateness of a royal presence in such a volatile region. But Sophie had been persistent, presenting detailed briefings about the humanitarian need and the potential positive impact of her visit. When permission was finally granted, Sophie had thrown herself into preparation with characteristic thoroughness. She studied briefing documents late into the night, consulted with aid agencies, and even took basic Arabic lessons to communicate more effectively with refugees. Her staff marveled at her dedication, noting how she seemed genuinely excited about the mission in a way that went beyond professional obligation. The reality of Sudan had been both exactly what Sophie expected and nothing she could have prepared for. The refugee camps were overwhelming in their scope and heartbreaking in their humanity. She had met mothers who had walked hundreds of miles carrying children, fathers who had lost everything but their determination to keep their families safe, and children whose eyes held experiences far beyond their years. Sophie had handled it all with grace. She listened to stories without flinching, embraced children covered in dust and illness, and sat with elderly refugees who wanted nothing more than for someone to acknowledge their existence. The aid workers commented later that they had never seen a dignitary show such genuine engagement, such willingness to truly see and hear the people she met. But there had been moments that the cameras didn't capture, moments that lodged themselves in Sophie's memory like shards of broken glass. The mother who pressed a photograph of her missing daughter into Sophie's hands, begging her to help find the child. The elderly man who broke down sobbing as he described watching his village burn, his words mixing Arabic and English in a desperate attempt to make her understand. The young girl, no more than 8 years old, who had stopped speaking entirely after witnessing her father's death. Each story had landed with physical force, accumulating in Sophie's chest like stones in a pocket, weighing her down even as she maintained her composure. She had learned to compartmentalize, to feel deeply in the moment while simultaneously filing those feelings away for later processing. It was a skill developed over years of royal duty, the ability to be present for other people's pain without being consumed by it. But some experiences resist compartmentalization. Some human suffering is too vast, too immediate, too connected to our own deepest fears about loss and helplessness to be neatly filed away. Sophie had encountered something in Sudan that exceeded her emotional filing system's capacity. The landing at RAF Brieyes Norton was smooth, the transfer to the waiting royal car efficient and professional. Sophie maintained her composed demeanor through the brief conversation with the base commander, through the polite exchanges with her protection team, through the familiar routine of royal travel. It was only when the car turned through the gates of her private residence that something inside her began to shift. James had been assigned to Sophie's protection detail for 3 years. He had accompanied her to dozens of engagements, from state dinners to hospital visits, from charity galas to school openings. He had seen her handle difficult situations with remarkable grace, comforting bereaved families, managing awkward diplomatic moments, dealing with hostile protesters or aggressive media. She was known throughout the protection service as one of the most professionally competent and personally considerate royals to work with. That's why the change in her demeanor was so noticeable. As the car wound through the familiar countryside toward her home, Sophie's carefully maintained composure began to show hairline cracks. Her breathing became slightly irregular. She stopped responding to her private secretary's gentle attempts at conversation. Most tellingly, she began to clutch that leather journal as if it were a lifeline. The residence appeared ahead, its Georgian facade warm and welcoming in the afternoon light. Home had always been Sophie's sanctuary, the one place where she could step out of her public role and simply exist as herself. The staff had prepared for her return with their usual efficiency. Fresh flowers in her private sitting room, her favorite tea ready to be served, her personal correspondence organized, and waiting for attention. But as the car pulled into the circular drive, Sophie made an unusual request. "I'd like to go straight to my rooms," she said quietly. "Please ask the staff not to disturb me for a few hours. I need some time to adjust." Her private secretary nodded understandingly. It was not uncommon for royals to need decompression time after intensive foreign missions. "Of course. Shall I schedule your debrief for tomorrow morning?" "Yes," Sophie replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "Tomorrow will be fine." James helped her from the car, noting again the way she held herself, straight-backed and dignified, but with an underlying tension that suggested enormous self-control rather than natural ease. She thanked her staff with her customary courtesy, but her words felt automatic, spoken from habit rather than genuine engagement. The house felt different somehow as Sophie moved through its familiar corridors. The same antique furniture, the same family portraits, the same soft carpet under her feet, everything exactly as she had left it 6 days earlier. But she moved through the space like a stranger, as if seeing it through new eyes that had witnessed too much. James followed at a respectful distance, maintaining the professional awareness that was second nature after years of protection work. But he was also following instinct, a growing sense that something significant was happening, something that went beyond normal post-mission fatigue. Sophie paused at the foot of the main staircase, her hand resting on the polished banister. For a moment, she seemed to hesitate, as if unsure of her direction. Then, she looked back at James with an expression he had never seen before. Vulnerable, uncertain, almost lost. "James," she said softly, "I think I might need some time alone. Really alone." He nodded professionally. "Of course. I'll be stationed outside if you need anything." But as Sophie climbed the stairs toward her private quarters, both she and James understood that something fundamental had shifted. The composed royal dignitary who had boarded the plane in Sudan that morning was not the same woman walking up these stairs. The journey home had been more than a change of geography. It had been the beginning of a reckoning that could no longer be postponed. The afternoon light streaming through the stained glass window on the landing cast colored shadows on Sophie's face as she reached the top of the stairs. For just a moment, she paused and looked back down at James, and in that glance was a recognition that they were crossing into uncharted territory. The rules that governed their professional relationship, the protocols that defined their interactions, might not be sufficient for whatever was about to unfold. Sophie disappeared around the corner toward her private suite, leaving James alone in the corridor with his thoughts and his growing certainty that this evening would be unlike any other in his career. Outside, the English countryside settled into its familiar evening rhythms, unaware that within these walls, a carefully constructed life was about to come apart. Sophie's private suite had always been her refuge, carefully designed to provide comfort and privacy away from the relentless demands of public life. The sitting room was decorated in soft blues and creams, with family photographs scattered on side tables and personal books lining custom-built shelves. French doors opened onto a small private balcony overlooking the garden, where she often took her morning coffee and reviewed her daily schedule. She set her travel bag down by the door and moved slowly through the familiar space, but nothing felt familiar anymore. The photographs seemed to be looking at her with accusatory eyes. The comfortable furniture felt foreign and unwelcoming. Even the air itself seemed different, as if the oxygen molecules had been replaced by something heavier, more difficult to breathe. The leather journal remained clutched in her hands. During the flight, she had tried to write down her thoughts, hoping that putting words to her experiences might help her process them. Instead, the act of writing had made everything more real, more immediate. The pages were filled with fragments of conversations, scattered observations, and increasingly desperate attempts to make sense of what she had witnessed. One entry, written somewhere over the Mediterranean, reads simply, "How do I go back to ribbon cuttings after this? How do I smile at garden parties when I know what's happening in the world?" Another, scrawled in shaky handwriting as turbulence shook the plane, "The little girl, Amara. She held my hand and wouldn't let go. What happened to her after we left? What happens to all of them after we leave?" Sophie sank into her favorite armchair, the same chair where she had practiced her speech for the Sudan mission just a week earlier. She had been so confident then, so certain that she could handle whatever she encountered. She had prepared for the logistical challenges, the security concerns, the diplomatic complexities. But no one had prepared her for the weight of carrying other people's stories, for the responsibility of being witness to suffering she was powerless to stop. The silence of the house pressed in around her. After 6 days of constant noise, aircraft engines, refugee camp crowds, translators, security briefings, media scrums, the quiet should have been welcome. Instead, it felt oppressive, leaving too much space for the memories to expand and echo. Downstairs, James had positioned himself in the main hallway, maintaining his professional vigilance while grappling with his own concerns. In 3 years of protecting Sophie, he had never seen her like this. She was known for her resilience, her ability to bounce back quickly from challenging engagements. Even after particularly emotional visits to hospitals or grief-stricken families, she typically recovered her equilibrium within hours. This felt different. The change in her demeanor had been gradual, but unmistakable throughout the return journey. It was as if she were slowly disappearing inside herself, retreating to some internal space where her professional training couldn't follow. James had received specialized training in recognizing signs of psychological distress in his charges. Royal protection officers were taught to watch for everything from simple fatigue to more serious mental health concerns. The job required them to be part bodyguard, part confidant, part psychological early warning system. But the training focused mainly on external threats and obvious behavioral changes. What he was seeing in Sophie was more subtle, a kind of internal collapse that was harder to identify and infinitely more difficult to address. The house staff moved quietly through their evening routines, sensing without being told that their employer needed space. Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper who had worked for Sophie's family for 20 years, prepared a light dinner tray without being asked, knowing from experience that Sophie rarely ate properly after long trips. The cook selected comfort foods, homemade soup, fresh bread, the kind of simple meal that might provide some grounding after the intensity of international travel. But when Mrs. Henderson knocked softly on Sophie's door to announce dinner, there was no response. She waited, knocked again more firmly, and finally called out, "Your Highness, I've prepared something for you to eat." The silence stretched uncomfortably long before Sophie's voice came through the door, strained and unfamiliar. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I'm not hungry just now. Perhaps you could leave it outside?" Mrs. Henderson exchanged a worried glance with James, who had appeared at the top of the stairs. In all her years of service, she had never known Sophie to refuse a meal or to avoid face-to-face interaction with staff. The princess was unfailingly courteous, always taking time to ask about their families and thank them personally for their work. "Should I call Dr. Williams?" Mrs. Henderson whispered to James, referring to Sophie's personal physician. James considered this carefully. "Let's give her the evening," he said quietly. "If she's not better by morning, we'll reassess." But even as he spoke, James was beginning to doubt the wisdom of leaving Sophie alone. His protective instincts were sending increasingly urgent signals, warning him that something significant was happening behind that closed door. Inside her suite, Sophie had moved to the window overlooking the garden. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the lawn where she had played as a child, where she had learned to ride her first pony, where she had taken her first formal photographs as a member of the royal family. The view should have been comforting, grounding her in memories of happiness and security. Instead, the familiar landscape seemed like something from another life, a life belonging to someone who hadn't seen the things she had seen, who didn't carry the weight of stories that demanded to be remembered but were too painful to bear. The journal had fallen open to a page where she had attempted to capture one particular moment from the refugee camp. A grandmother had approached her, carrying a baby who couldn't have been more than 6 months old. The woman spoke no English, but her eyes communicated everything: exhaustion, desperation, a fierce protective love, and above all, hope that this foreign princess might somehow help. Sophie had held the baby, feeling its tiny weight in her arms, looking into eyes that already held too much knowledge of the world's cruelty. The cameras had captured the moment beautifully, the princess cradling the child, both their faces soft with emotion. It would become one of the defining images of the trip, printed in newspapers around the world as evidence of royal compassion and international concern. But what the cameras hadn't captured was what happened next. As Sophie prepared to hand the baby back to its grandmother, the child had reached up and grasped Sophie's necklace, a simple gold chain that had belonged to her own grandmother. The baby held on with surprising strength, and for a moment, Sophie felt an almost physical pulling sensation, as if the child were trying to communicate something urgent and necessary. When she finally extracted her necklace from the baby's grasp, Sophie had seen something in the grandmother's eyes that would haunt her for the rest of her life. It wasn't gratitude or hope. It was resignation. The old woman understood that this moment of attention, this brief connection, would change nothing about her circumstances. The foreign princess would leave, the cameras would go away, and she would still be standing in a refugee camp with a dying grandchild and no way to save him. That look of resignation had cut through Sophie's professional composure like a knife. She had managed to continue with the visit, to maintain her smile and deliver her remarks, but something essential had broken inside her in that moment. Some illusion about the meaning and impact of her work had been shattered beyond repair. The sound of rain beginning to fall against the windows brought Sophie back to the present moment. She looked down at her hands and was surprised to see that she was shaking. The trembling seemed to begin in her chest and radiate outward, a physical manifestation of the emotional earthquake happening inside her. For the first time in her adult life, Sophie felt completely unprepared for what was required of her. Tomorrow there would be debriefings, follow-up meetings, media interviews about the mission's success. She would be expected to articulate the positive outcomes, to translate her experiences into diplomatic language that would advance policy goals and humanitarian initiatives. But how could she explain that the trip had fundamentally changed her understanding of her own role? How could she admit that she was no longer certain whether her work made any real difference, or whether it was simply elaborate theater designed to make people feel better about problems they had no intention of actually solving? The rain grew heavier, drumming against the windows with increasing intensity. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed 6 times, marking the transition from afternoon to evening. Sophie realized she had been sitting motionless for over an hour, lost in memories that seemed to be growing more vivid rather than fading. She stood up abruptly, disturbed by her own passivity, and began to pace around the room. Movement had always helped her think, helped her process difficult emotions. But tonight, even walking felt wrong. Her body moved through the familiar space, but her mind remained trapped in the refugee camp, replaying conversations and images with exhausting repetition. The journal lay open on the chair where she had left it, its pages filled with her increasingly frantic attempts to make sense of her experiences. She picked it up and tried to read her own words, but the handwriting seemed to belong to someone else, someone desperate and confused and fundamentally different from the woman who had left England 6 days earlier. One entry caught her attention. "I used to think I understood suffering because I visited hospitals and met grieving families. But that was suffering with safety nets, medical care, insurance, government support. This is suffering without rescue. This is what it looks like when the world simply looks away." The word stared back at her like an accusation. Had her previous work been nothing more than privileged tourism? Had she been using other people's pain to feel better about her own comfortable life? Outside her door, James remained at his post, but his professional composure was beginning to crack. The absolute silence from Sophie's room was more concerning than crying or talking would have been. He had worked with people in crisis before, and experience had taught him that complete withdrawal often preceded complete breakdown. He found himself checking his watch every few minutes, calculating how long he should wait before intervening. The protocol was clear. Royals were entitled to privacy in their personal quarters unless there was evidence of immediate danger. But the protocol hadn't been written for situations like this, where the danger was internal and invisible. Mrs. Henderson appeared again with a fresh tea tray, her expression openly worried. "Still no sound from up there," she reported quietly. "And she hasn't touched the dinner I left outside her door." James nodded grimly. "I think we may need to consider options." But before they could discuss what those options might be, a sound drifted down from Sophie's suite that made them both freeze. It was barely audible at first, so quiet they might have imagined it. But then it came again, and there was no mistaking what they were hearing. Sophie was crying. Not the controlled, dignified tears that might be expected after an emotional mission, but something deeper and more desperate, The sound carried through the door and down the corridor like a physical presence, raw and heartbroken and utterly human. James felt his professional detachment evaporate. Training and protocol suddenly seemed irrelevant in the face of such obvious pain. He moved toward the stairs, every instinct telling him that whatever was happening behind that door, Sophie shouldn't have to face it alone. The sound of Sophie's breakdown was unlike anything James had heard in his professional career. It wasn't the measured grief of someone processing a specific loss or the controlled emotional release that might follow a particularly challenging engagement. This was something primal and devastating, the sound of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. James stood at the bottom of the staircase, torn between his duty to respect Sophie's privacy and his growing certainty that she was in genuine distress. The royal protection protocols were clear about maintaining appropriate boundaries, but they had been written by people who had never heard a member of the royal family crying as if their heart was breaking. The crying continued, rising and falling in waves that seemed to correspond to some internal struggle James could only imagine. Between the sobs, he could hear fragments of words, though he couldn't make out what Sophie was saying. The tone suggested she might be talking to someone, but he knew she was alone in the room. Mrs. Henderson appeared beside him, her face pale with concern. She had worked for royal families for most of her adult life and had developed an almost maternal protective instinct toward the young people in her care. The sound from upstairs was clearly distressing her almost as much as it was James. "Sir," she whispered, "in 30 years of service, I've never heard anything like this. Something terrible has happened to that poor girl." James nodded, his professional facade finally cracking. "I know, but I'm not sure what I'm authorized to do about it." The protocol for dealing with royal family members in psychological distress was intentionally vague, largely because such situations were supposed to be managed by family members, personal physicians, or senior palace officials. James was trained to handle physical threats, security breaches, and medical emergencies. He wasn't equipped to deal with what appeared to be a complete emotional collapse. But as the crying intensified, protocol began to seem irrelevant. Sophie was clearly in pain, clearly alone, and clearly beyond her ability to cope with whatever was happening to her. James had sworn an oath to protect her, and standing in a hallway while she suffered seemed like a fundamental violation of that commitment. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling like a transgression against years of training and professional behavior. At Sophie's door, he paused, listening to the heartbreaking sounds from within. The crying had become mixed with something that sounded like talking, though her words were too distorted by tears to understand. James knocked softly, barely loud enough to be heard. "Your Highness? It's James. Are you all right?" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that was somehow even more concerning. James waited, counting his heartbeats, before knocking again. "Sophie." He used her first name deliberately, abandoning formal protocol. "I'm concerned about you. Would you like to talk?" Still silence. But then, so quietly he almost missed it, came her voice. I can't make it stop." "Make what stop?" James asked gently, moving closer to the door. "The pictures. The sounds. That little girl who wouldn't speak. The grandmother with the baby. The man who lost his son. They're all here, James. They're all in my head, and I can't make them stop." James felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't just post-mission fatigue or normal emotional processing. Sophie was describing something that sounded like trauma, the kind of psychological wound that could develop when someone witnessed more suffering than their mind could safely absorb. "Can I come in?" he asked. "I think you shouldn't be alone right now." Another long pause. "Then I'm not presentable." "I don't care about presentable, Sophie. I care about whether you're safe." The lock clicked, and James heard footsteps moving away from the door. He waited a moment before turning the handle and stepping into Sophie's private sanctuary. The room looked like a battlefield. Clothes were scattered across the floor, where Sophie had apparently thrown them while trying to get out of her travel outfit. The dinner tray Mrs. Henderson had left outside sat untouched by the door, its contents cold and congealing. Papers were strewn across every surface, briefing documents, notes from the Sudan mission, photographs that had clearly been looked at and discarded multiple times. Sophie stood by the window with her back to him, wearing a simple robe and looking smaller than James had ever seen her. Her usually perfect hair hung loose and tangled around her shoulders. Her posture spoke of complete exhaustion, as if the act of standing required more energy than she possessed. "I don't know how to do this," she said without turning around. Her voice was hoarse from crying, barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to carry all of this and still be who everyone expects me to be." James moved slowly into the room, his trained eyes automatically assessing for any signs of immediate danger while his heart broke for the woman in front of him. "You don't have to be anyone right now except yourself." Sophie laughed bitterly. "That's the problem. I don't know who that is anymore. For my entire life, I've been defined by my role, by what I'm supposed to do for other people. But what happens when you realize your role might be meaningless?" She turned to face him, and James was shocked by what he saw. Sophie's eyes were red and swollen from crying, but it was more than that. She looked fundamentally different, younger somehow, more vulnerable, but also older in ways that spoke of premature aging under unbearable weight. "In Sudan," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, "I met people who had lost everything. Absolutely everything. Their homes, their families, their countries, their hope. And I showed up with my cameras and my security detail and my designer clothes, and I thought I was helping." She moved to a chair where several photographs lay scattered. They were official mission photos, the kind typically used for press releases and annual reports. Sophie picked one up, the image of her holding the baby while the grandmother looked on. "Do you see this picture, James? This was supposed to be the moment that made it all worthwhile. The princess connecting with the refugees, showing that the world cares. But look at the grandmother's eyes. Really look." James studied the photograph and gradually saw what Sophie meant. Behind the exhaustion and desperation in the old woman's face was something else, a kind of resigned awareness that this moment was performance, not rescue. "She knew," Sophie said, her voice breaking again. "She knew I was going to leave, and nothing would change for her. She let me hold her grandchild because it was required, because important people need to feel important. But she didn't believe for a second that it would make any difference." Sophie sank into the chair, clutching the photograph against her chest. "And she was right, James. What did we actually accomplish? We raised awareness. We generated positive media coverage. We strengthened diplomatic relationships. But that baby is still dying in a refugee camp, and I'm sitting in a mansion planning my next ribbon cutting." The rain outside had intensified, creating a cocoon of white noise that made the room feel isolated from the rest of the world. James realized that this was probably the first time in Sophie's adult life that she was speaking completely honestly about her work, without the filter of diplomatic necessity or public relations considerations. "I used to think I was making a difference," she continued, tears streaming down her face. "I used to believe that royal visits and patronages and charity work actually helped people. But what if it's all just elaborate theater designed to make us feel better about not doing anything real?" James sat down carefully on the edge of a nearby ottoman, maintaining enough distance to respect her space while staying close enough to provide support. "What would real look like to you?" Sophie looked at him with surprise, as if no one had ever asked her that question before. "I don't know. Actually fixing things instead of just visiting them? Giving up the palaces and the titles and the privileges and using all that money to build schools and hospitals? Living in the refugee camps until every person there has a safe place to go." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, like a child rather than a princess. "But I can't do any of that, can I? I can't give up my role because it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the institution, to the country, to history. I'm just a person temporarily occupying it." James had never heard a member of the royal family speak with such brutal honesty about the constraints of their position. Sophie was articulating something that he suspected many of them felt, but could never say, the trapped feeling that came with inherited responsibility, the weight of representing something larger than yourself, whether you wanted to or not. "So what am I supposed to do?" Sophie asked, looking directly at him for the first time since he had entered the room. "How do I go back to my regular life, knowing what I know now? How do I smile at garden parties and cut ribbons and give speeches about hope when I've seen what real desperation looks like?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable and crucial. James realized that Sophie wasn't just having an emotional breakdown. She was having an existential crisis that went to the core of her identity and purpose. Outside, the storm continued to rage, as if nature itself were responding to the emotional turbulence in the room. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating Sophie's tear-stained face in stark black and white. In that moment, James saw her not as a royal figure or a public personality, but as a human being struggling with the fundamental question of how to live a meaningful life in a world full of suffering. The sound of the storm seemed to give Sophie's grief a soundtrack, and she began crying again, not the desperate sobs from earlier, but a quieter, deeper weeping that sounded like mourning. James understood that she was grieving not just for what she had seen in Sudan, but for her own lost illusions about her life and work. "I can't go back," she whispered, so quietly that James had to strain to hear her over the rain. "I can't pretend I don't know what I know now." And in that moment, both Sophie and James understood that they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Whatever happened next, Sophie's life as she had known it was over. The carefully constructed identity that had sustained her for 30 years had cracked beyond repair, and there was no going back to the comfortable certainties that had once defined her existence. The storm raged on outside, but inside the room, a different kind of storm was just beginning. The hours that followed would remain forever etched in James Morrison's memory, not as a series of events he witnessed, but as a transformation he was privileged to guard. As the storm continued to rage outside, something fundamental shifted inside Sophie's private sanctuary, a breaking down that somehow contained the seeds of rebuilding. Sophie had stopped crying, but she hadn't found peace. Instead, she had entered a state of intense contemplation that James recognized from his military background, the mental space soldiers occupied when processing combat trauma. She moved around the room restlessly, picking up and discarding items, starting sentences she couldn't finish, grappling with thoughts that seemed too large for words. "You know what the worst part is?" she said, stopping suddenly, in front of a formal portrait of herself from her official royal photography session. The image showed her in full regalia, tiara, ceremonial dress, the works. She looked every inch the fairy tale princess. "The worst part is that I was proud of this mission. I thought I was being brave and meaningful and making a real contribution." She touched the glass covering the portrait, her finger tracing the outline of her own face. "But I was just performing, playing dress-up with other people's trauma. And everyone will tell me what a wonderful job I did, how much good I accomplished, how proud they are of my service." James watched her carefully, noting the way her thinking was becoming clearer, even as her emotional distress remained intense. This wasn't the confused crying from earlier. This was someone working through a fundamental realization about their life and identity. "What if," Sophie continued, turning to face him, "what if the entire concept of royal patronage is fundamentally flawed? What if we're just providing a pretty distraction from the fact that we could solve these problems if we really wanted to, but we don't want to badly enough?" She moved to her desk, where her laptop sat closed among scattered papers. "I have access to resources most people can't imagine. I could liquidate trust funds, sell jewelry, mortgage properties. I could probably raise £50 million with a few phone calls." £50 million, James. Do you know what that could buy in terms of actual refugee relief? The question wasn't rhetorical. Sophie was calculating, working through possibilities with the same methodical approach she brought to all her projects. But James could see that she was also talking herself towards something dangerous, the kind of all-or-nothing thinking that could lead to devastating decisions. "But you can't do that," he said gently. "Not without destroying everything else you might be able to accomplish in the future." Sophie's laugh was bitter. "What future accomplishments?" More photo opportunities? More speeches that change nothing? More visits to problems I'm not allowed to actually solve. She opened the laptop and began pulling up files, briefing documents from previous missions, reports on charitable initiatives, photographs from years of royal engagements. The screen light cast harsh shadows on her face as she scrolled through what amounted to a digital catalog of her adult life. "Look at this," she said, clicking through images. Hospital visit, school opening, charity gala, disaster relief photo opportunity, veterans commemoration. All of it beautiful, all of it meaningful looking, all of it ultimately insignificant. James moved closer, concerned by the direction of her thinking. "Sophie, you're exhausted and traumatized. This isn't the time to make major life decisions." But Sophie was beyond hearing warnings about timing or emotional state. She had entered the kind of mental space where clarity and crisis intersected, where fundamental truths became impossible to ignore regardless of their inconvenience. "I met a doctor in Sudan," she said, her voice taking on a distant quality as she accessed the memory. "Dr. Sarah Chun. She's been working refugee camps for 15 years. Do you know what she told me? She said the problem isn't lack of resources or even lack of awareness. The problem is that the international community has gotten comfortable with managing crises instead of solving them." Sophie closed the laptop and turned to face the rain-lashed window. She said humanitarian aid has become an industry unto itself. We've created a system that depends on ongoing catastrophe to justify its existence. And people like me, well-intentioned rich people who show up with cameras and good intentions, we're part of that system. We make everyone feel like something is being done while ensuring that nothing fundamental ever changes. The words hung in the air like an accusation, not just against Sophie, but against the entire structure of international humanitarian response. James realized he was witnessing someone dismantle not just their own worldview, but the assumptions underlying an entire class of privileged activism. "So what are you saying?" he asked quietly. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice had a quality James had never heard before. Not the polish of royal training or the warmth of personal engagement, but something raw and absolutely honest. "I'm saying I think I've been living a lie. A beautiful, well-intentioned, carefully maintained lie, but a lie nonetheless. And I don't know how to go back to living it now that I can see what it really is." She moved away from the window and sat down heavily in her reading chair, looking suddenly exhausted in a way that went beyond physical fatigue. "Tomorrow morning, my private secretary will want to schedule follow-up meetings about the Sudan mission. We'll discuss which initiatives to support, which partnerships to develop, which aspects of the trip to emphasize in future speeches. And I'll be expected to participate in all of it as if it matters, as if any of it will make a real difference." James felt helpless in the face of Sophie's despair, but also honored to be witnessing such fundamental honesty. He understood that she was sharing thoughts she would never be able to express to family members, palace officials, or even close friends. The constraints of her position made authentic conversation about these issues nearly impossible with anyone who might feel obligated to report back to higher authorities. "What would matter?" he asked. "If everything you're doing now doesn't matter, what would?" Sophie looked at him with something like surprise, as if the question had never occurred to her. "I don't know. No one's ever asked me to think about that before. My role has always been defined by what's expected, not by what might be effective." She stood up and began pacing again, but this time with more purpose. "But if I could design my own role, if I could ignore all the protocol and expectations and political considerations, I think I want to live in the camps. Not visit them, live in them. Stay until every person has somewhere safe to go." James watched her face as she spoke, seeing something he had never seen before. Sophie imagining herself as something other than a princess. "I want to use my profile to shame governments into action. Not diplomatic action, not carefully worded statements, but actual intervention. I want to be so annoying, so persistent, so impossible to ignore that people would have to choose between helping refugees and publicly explaining why they won't." She was gaining momentum now, her voice stronger with each word. "I'd liquidate everything. Every trust fund, every inheritance, every piece of jewelry that isn't permanently attached to the crown. I'd use it all to buy land, build cities, create permanent solutions instead of temporary relief." James realized that Sophie wasn't just processing trauma. She was redesigning her life in real time, imagining a version of herself that could act on her convictions without regard for institutional constraints. "But I can't do any of that," she continued, her voice dropping back to exhaustion. "Because I'm not Sophie the person, I'm Sophie the institution. And the institution has requirements that have nothing to do with effectiveness and everything to do with maintaining itself." The storm outside was beginning to subside, but the emotional tempest in the room was reaching its crescendo. Sophie sat down on the floor beside her scattered papers, looking lost among the documents that represented her official life. "So what do I do, James? How do I reconcile what I know now with what I'm required to be? How do I go back to playing princess when I've seen what real problems look like?" James sat down on the floor beside her, abandoning the last pretense of formal protocol. "Maybe you don't go back. Maybe you go forward differently." Sophie looked at him questioningly. "You can't liquidate the trust funds or abandon your role," he continued. "But you can change how you use the role you have. You can't live in refugee camps, but you can make it impossible for people to ignore what's happening in them. You can't solve everything, but you can make it much harder for governments to do nothing." For the first time all evening, Sophie's face showed something other than despair. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe the answer isn't abandoning the institution, but subverting it, using your platform and access and protected status to push harder than anyone expects. Being the royal family member who asks uncomfortable questions and refuses to accept comfortable answers." Sophie was listening intently now, and James could see her mind working through possibilities. "You have something most activists don't have," he continued. "You have access to world leaders, guaranteed media coverage, and a level of social protection that makes you almost impossible to silence. What if you used all of that not to manage problems, but to solve them?" The rain had stopped, and pale dawnlight was beginning to filter through the windows. Neither Sophie nor James had noticed the passage of time, too focused on the conversation that was reshaping everything. "It will be career suicide," Sophie said finally. "The palace would be furious. The government would be uncomfortable. Half the charities I work with would probably drop me." "Probably," James agreed. "But would that be worse than spending the rest of your life feeling like a fraud?" Sophie was quiet for a long moment, and James could almost see her weighing the costs and benefits of different approaches to her impossible situation. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a determination he had never heard before. "I think," she said slowly, "I think I'd rather be a failed activist than a successful ornament." She looked around the room at the scattered papers and photographs. The evidence of her official life spread across every surface. Then, she looked at James with clear eyes for the first time since entering the room hours earlier. "Will you help me figure out how to do this without destroying everything? How to use what I have instead of running away from it?" James nodded without hesitation, understanding that he was witnessing the birth of something entirely new. A member of the royal family who intended to use her position as a weapon for change rather than a symbol of stability. "We'll figure it out," he said. "But first you need to sleep, and eat something, and maybe take a shower." Sophie laughed, the first genuine laughter James had heard from her since returning from Sudan. "Do I look that bad?" "You look like someone who just survived a psychological revolution," he said, "which is exactly what you are." As the sun rose over the English countryside, painting Sophie's room in soft gold light, both she and James understood that something fundamental had changed. The woman who had climbed these stairs the evening before, broken by the weight of what she had witnessed, was gone. In her place was someone harder, clearer, and infinitely more dangerous to the systems that had created her. The princess was dead. What emerged in the morning light was something much more interesting. A royal revolutionary, protected by protocol and powered by purpose, ready to turn her privileged position into a weapon for justice. The breakdown was over. The real work was just beginning.